Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. We are in the city of Hillsdale, Michigan today. This is a smaller community in Michigan with a population of just around 40,000 people. This area is known for its farming, primarily soybeans and corn. Hillsdale was home to a lot of families who grew up there and then moved down the street. You didn't have to look far to see a friendly face. One of the town's residents, Shannon Mohr, moved to Hillsdale from Toledo, Ohio. She was 25 years old and worked as a nurse. She loved helping people, and her career choice was a perfect fit. In September of 1979, Shannon met a man named David Davis at a mutual friend's wedding, and she fell in love. No, this is not the same David Davis who assumed Ronald Platt's identity in England, but wouldn't that be something? David was 11 years older than Shannon and owned several farms all over the United States and Belize. Shannon and David really hit it off, and she was very excited about their upcoming date that they had planned. They had a great date and ended up talking for hours. Shannon had come home the happiest she had ever been. Shannon's parents met David very soon after, and they just thought he was the greatest guy and the perfect fit for their daughter. He was very personable and friendly, and the two of them just really clicked. After just 8 weeks of dating, Shannon and David got married and moved to one of David's farms. It was a larger property, and Shannon and David had talked about starting a family, and this farm seemed like the perfect place to do so. Life was going great on the farm, and the couple eventually bought 2 Tennessee walking horses, which are known to have a calm temperament and demeanor. On July 23, 1980, Shannon and David got on their horses to ride down the road to see their neighbor, a man named Dick Britton, who lived in the next pasture over. David was very handy, having been the proprietor of many farms, and knew a thing or two about the many pieces of operating equipment necessary for running a farm. Their neighbor was having an issue with some of his equipment, and David had been over several times to help him. David had spent a little over half an hour trying to fix this particular piece of equipment, and Shannon had asked if Dick's son could come home with them. He would regularly come over as he liked to play in Shannon and David's field and with their horses. Before Dick could turn around and say yes, David interjected and said, "No, you can get him in the morning." After that, Shannon and David had got back on their horses and made their way home. Instead of heading back down the gravel road to their home, David led the two through the woods, which was a shortcut. Dick waved goodbye as the couple rode off. But just a few minutes later, David and his horse hurried out of the woods back to Dick's field. He was in a panic, he was sweaty, and he had blood all over his shirt. It had looked like he had been in a fight. He said to Dick, "Come quick." Shannon's horse had bucked her off, and when she fell, she hit her head on a rock and was hurt pretty bad. When David and Dick had returned to find her in the woods, Shannon was laying motionless on her back in a puddle of her own blood, and her eyes were closed. Her shoes were off and were laying next to her, and her shirt had been unbuttoned, which is an odd thing to happen upon being bucked from a horse. Dick thought this was strange, but he didn't question it. He was more concerned with getting Shannon medical attention. Instead of calling an ambulance, they ended up carrying Shannon back to Dick's home and placed her in the back of his truck and rushed her to the emergency room. As they pulled into the hospital's driveway, a nurse came out and helped to carry Shannon and put her in a wheelchair. She was immediately taken in, and her vitals were checked, except there weren't any. Shannon had been pronounced dead at 8:45 p.m. When Shannon's parents had heard news of her accident, they rushed to the hospital and found David crying in the waiting room. He then shared the news of her passing. X-rays were taken of Shannon's skull, and the wounds were consistent with what David had said. She had been thrown off her horse and hit her head on a rock. Her official cause of death was ruled as the result of multiple cranial and cervical spine injuries. Shannon did not have an autopsy performed since she had died in and been declared dead in 2 different counties, and each was out of the other's jurisdiction. I'm not sure why she wasn't just then taken to the county that she had died in after ruling this, but I believe it's because the nature of her death was ruled an accident, and the coroner, for whatever reason, didn't see reason to investigate further. The lack of an autopsy later cast a dark cloud over Shannon's family. Shannon's mom recalls how they had met David at the hospital and how he had embraced them when they arrived, and Shannon's mom remembers seeing something odd. She saw 3 large, deep scratches on David's right hand. They appeared to be fresh. In the heat of the moment, with everything that just happened, as you can imagine, emotions were running so high, and she didn't ask him about it. In between the crying, David had insisted that Shannon wanted to be cremated, and he intended to honor her wishes. Shannon's dad was not so sure. Like her parents, Shannon was raised Catholic, and cremation was opposed. Shannon's parents were intending on taking her back to Ohio to bury her in the family plot. David was very against this. Just then, their neighbor Dick chimed in and said, "David, you have to let them take her back to Ohio. That's her family, and those are her wishes." David seemed to eventually agree and didn't press it further. The following day, the local police department went to investigate and survey the scene. Once there, they did find the rock that Shannon had hit her head on, and it was covered in dried blood. When they looked around, they didn't see any other rocks. How did Shannon get thrown from her horse and just so happen to hit her head on the only rock in the area? That seems suspicious. A few feet away were Shannon's shoes, lying as if they had just been tossed rather than placed, and they were untied, seeming to indicate that they were purposely taken off as opposed to being kicked off. After taking a few pictures, the police left. Dick had asked one of the officers about Shannon's shoes and was told, "Oh, you can have them." And Dick was like, "Don't you need them for evidence or something?" And the officer was like, "What for?" What for? A few days after this sad excuse of an investigation, Shannon's parents had arranged her funeral. Of the many people in attendance, included were David's parents, who Shannon's parents had never gotten the chance to meet. After a short conversation with David's parents, Shannon's parents felt everything they knew about David began to crumble. David was not as well off as he led them to believe. He was not the proprietor of several farms all over the country, and unbeknownst to them, and most likely Shannon, David had previously been married and had 2 daughters. After hearing essentially everything they knew about their daughter's husband was a lie, they started to question everything, including Shannon's death being an accident. They were kicking themselves for not pushing for an autopsy, but you can't blame yourself when you don't know, and the circumstances were just so different now. Not only to them, but Shannon and David's neighbor Dick had similar thoughts. He remembers the day after Shannon's accident, where he was sitting with David at his dining room table, and David had asked them if their neighbor on the other side was still interested in selling his farm. Dick thought this was a weird question, and certainly weird timing. Like, your wife just died yesterday, and you want to buy another farm? David was just like, never mind, drop it. And he left after that. Dick just kept thinking that was odd, and had a feeling that something was off ever since. Shannon's parents, along with Dick, just couldn't keep their suspicions to themselves anymore, and a week later went to police. While there, Shannon's parents had found out that during the 10 short months they were married, David had taken out several life insurance policies for Shannon, totaling more than $330,000. Wow. At this point, Shannon's parents were like, it's obvious something is not right here. We need an autopsy done immediately. They filled out the paperwork, and Shannon's body was exhumed a month later. When the coroner performed the autopsy, he had discovered a huge 3-inch gash on the back of Shannon's head. She also had several bruises and abrasions to her back, shoulder, hand, and cheekbone. Despite all of this, the coroner had determined that there was no evidence of foul play. Like how? Instead, ruling that Shannon had died of a head injury, and at that point, the case was closed. Shannon's parents did not buy this. They knew something was overlooked or something was missing. This just was not adding up. They demanded answers. A reporter named Billy Bowles agreed with Sharon's parents and did some digging of his own. The findings of his independent investigation uncovered some less than flattering things about David Davis, including the fact that he had a history of making the bulk of his money from filing suspicious insurance claims. Remember, he had tried claiming $330,000 from Shannon's policies, the ones that he had purchased in the first place. One claim in particular was for a fire that had occurred on one of the farms that he had owned, and the circumstances surrounding the fire were suspicious. David ended up collecting $30,000 in insurance for the property, which, upon a later investigation, had been for an empty, run-down farmhouse that had not been lived in for quite some time. How he was able to get a claim of that size was definitely questionable for that property. In another instance, when David was conveniently out of town, a barn that he owned had burned down, and for that he collected around $6,000. Following these fires, he had left a job that he held for a short time at the Chrysler Company due to an injury that many felt were suspicious at the time, and after going through his insurance, he was able to receive workman's comp as well as Social Security. There was such a short time between all of these incidents. The likelihood of these being coincidental accidents rather than deliberate acts was very, very slim. But he was able to essentially get away with making all of these claims with little to no investigation. Billy's investigation also uncovered that David had studied pharmacology in college. He thought this information might have been called into play or used in some way to incapacitate Shannon or alter her state of being. When Shannon's family had found out about this, they called the state's attorney general to request that he open a new investigation. If you ask me, there was really no investigation conducted in the first place, so this was literally the very least they could do. Ultimately, Shannon's cause of death was due to a single blow to the head. The detective on the case thought it could have been one of two things. Shannon was thrown from her horse and somehow managed to hit her head on the one single rock in the area, or she was murdered by David. Before we go any further, knowing what you know now, do you believe this was an accident? If Shannon was actually bucked off her horse, the horse would have lurched forward, which would have been head first, and she would have likely landed face forward, or, depending on the speed, there might have been enough force to go forward and roll. If the horse went up on its back legs, Shannon would have slid off the back, and you would assume that she would have grabbed the reins or tried to steady the horse in some way. It was her horse after all. It knew her. She wasn't a stranger. But assuming that she was thrown off the horse in this way, it is extremely unlikely that Shannon would have landed in that way, flat on her back, not even factoring in the fact that she hit her head on the only rock in town, but her shirt was unbuttoned, and her shoes were untied and off. We'll get into that soon, but let's get back to the physics of the horse throw. The detective basically established that the way in which she was found was inconsistent with being thrown from a horse. You don't say. He believes that David drugged her in some way, that she wouldn't be able to move or be in control of her person, but would have left her heart still beating, as he was counting on their neighbor Dick being there with him to see that she was still alive. We know that David was experienced in pharmacology, so he would be more knowledgeable than the average person about what would make someone paralyzed to the point of near death. Detectives asked veterinarians about what drugs or tranquilizers farmers would use on their animals, like cows or horses, that could potentially cause this type of paralysis. You're probably familiar with the drug I'm about to say, as it has come up many times before. The most commonly used muscle relaxant for animal surgeries is succinylcholine. It is also used for humans after anesthesia is administered, but in large doses, it is fatal. It is believed this drug was used as it is known to relax the skeletal muscles, but not the heart, so it will continue beating, and the administered will continue breathing. It is also very difficult to trace. After it is injected, it starts to break down almost immediately, so if you don't test for it then and there, you won't find anything. Even if you do test for it then and there, the likelihood of it showing up on a toxicology report it's not. David had seemed to essentially get away with murder. As David was waiting on his insurance payout, he sold his farm and home and moved to the Bahamas with his new girlfriend. Months went by as police were still conducting their investigation, and he wouldn't be able to collect before then. This was tricky since, based on Shannon's injuries, They were consistent with David's version of events and accepted as her cause of death. Detectives couldn't get over how suspicious the crime scene was, though. Because Shannon's shoes were found untied and off, police wondered if they may have been removed by David in the aftermath of an attack. The bloody rock was the only one around and just seemed too convenient. They began to wonder if it was possible that David had somehow forced her off her horse and overpowered her, injecting her with the succinylcholine to paralyze her to the point of near death. Because it was undetectable, they had few options. If you remember our very first case together about the Ricos, we learned that at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, they had developed a way to test for succinylcholine in embalmed tissue. Tissue samples were taken from Shannon to the Karolinska Institute, where it took toxicologists several weeks and hundreds of tests to positively determine that Shannon had succinylcholine in her body. Once word of this got back to detectives in Michigan, they couldn't believe it. They were so excited. But they needed confirmation that David had actually injected her, and where. Once again, Shannon's body was exhumed. Because of the previous autopsy report, the coroner had identified that most of her injuries had occurred on the left side of her body. Bruises, cuts, abrasions, all on her left side. There was one suspicious bruise on her right shoulder and another on her right ring finger. Tissue samples were then taken of the bruised area and flown back to the Karolinska Institute. While analyzed there, the tissue samples from Shannon's shoulder and wrist contained very high concentrations of succinylcholine, which had indicated that she had been injected twice. After these findings, David Davis was officially charged with Shannon Mohr's murder. However, when police went to arrest him, they couldn't find him. If you recall, several months earlier, David split to the Bahamas, but he had to be reachable to collect his insurance payout, so it was in his best interest to not be completely off the grid. David ended up eluding police for more than 8.5 years until a local TV station had aired a story about Shannon's death, and one of David's former girlfriends had called police with a tip. The woman was reluctant to give much information as she feared for her life. She did reveal that David was currently living in American Samoa and was going by the name David Meyer Bell. While in American Samoa, he had gotten married and was doing his best to live another life. Because police had this new identity to look into, they discovered that in the years since Shannon's death, he had lived in San Diego, Alaska, and Hawaii. He had also taken flying lessons upon moving to Samoa and ended up finally being tracked down at the Pago Pago airport and was arrested. He was then transported to Michigan to await his trial. If you remember, David and Shannon had only been dating for 8 weeks before they got engaged and married, but detectives had also found out that David had had a series of girlfriends who he had dated for a very short time before proposing. In 14 months, he had courted and proposed to 5 other women. All of them had turned him down, thinking, "Wow, this is weird. We've only known each other for a few weeks, and you want to get married? I don't even know your favorite color." Shannon was the 6th woman he had proposed to, and the first who had accepted. During the trial, it was obvious that the motive behind Shannon's murder had been money, and prosecutors were confident that they could prove that the murder had been premeditated. They believe that David had planned to ride out on their horses to their neighbor's house, so he would have seen the two of them together and confirm that Shannon was alive and well before her accident. David somehow convinced Shannon to get off her horse, and because she started to get undressed, it was suspected that since the couple had been known to get busy outdoors, this was another one of those instances. As Shannon untied and took off her shoes and began to unbutton her shirt, it is believed that David first came up behind her and injected her in the shoulder with the succinylcholine, and because it didn't immediately take effect, there was a struggle, and David picked up a rock and hit her in the head with it. By this time, Shannon might have been rendered unconscious, and David once again injected her with the succinylcholine, this time on her hand. Because of the heavy dosage, Shannon was killed in a matter of minutes. Armed with this information, the jury deliberated, and 2.5 hours later, they returned with a guilty verdict. David Davis was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. On November 9th, 2014, David died at the Michigan Department of Corrections, Duane L. Waters Health Center in Jackson, at the age of 70 due to congenital neuromuscular disease. This is one of those cases where he really almost got away with it. He had tested the waters to see what he could get away with in the past, and clearly had premeditated this crime. I'm glad to see that he actually served life in prison. Of course, this is not enough. Shannon's family will never get to see her again, but David will never get the chance to hurt anybody else. Let me know what you think about this case and the handling of the initial investigation, and how Shannon's family had essentially brought her killer to justice. I know of a few instances where people only knew each other for a short time before getting married and it worked out, but do what's best for you and give yourself time to get to know somebody. This guy had Shannon's whole family fooled into thinking he was this person he was pretending to be. His true self might have been revealed given more time, but we'll never know. Please use your very best judgment and don't be afraid to voice your concerns. And with that, that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.